The Vote, Louisiana Women Lead, made possible by WGBH. Additional funding by SANDRA HERMAN. For decades, the women of America fought for the right to vote. Louisiana women joined that fight, but also took on other issues like equal rights.
It's not just this fight for a vote, it's a fight for the opportunity to participate fully as a citizen.
The right to vote was won, but many found they could not exercise that right.
We started our own voter registration workshops, we call them. They were hungry to vote. They wanted to have a voice in the government.
A vacancy occurred at Civil District Court in 1984. I was the first woman elected to that court, and to tell you the truth, it seemed as if I had walked into a men's locker room.
She had a passion for social justice, really wanted to work for the empowerment of women and African Americans. I thought, why isn't anyone listening to what the women have to say?
They are now, thanks to the women who fought for suffrage, equality, and not just a place at the table, but the head of it. In the 19th century, women in Louisiana joined women nationwide to gain the right to vote. The momentum from that movement also saw women here at home take on other important issues as well, while continuing to build their strength as leaders decades into the 21st century. In this half hour, we'll get reacquainted with some of the women from Louisiana who saw the need for change and led the way to make it happen.
The 1848 Seneca Falls Convention, which is in New York, is what a lot of people consider kind of the beginning marker for the suffrage movement in the United States. In Louisiana and New Orleans, we look more at about 1878, 1879, which is when the first moment we see historically where women are reaching out to the local political leaders and asking, making the case for expanding suffrage to women. In 1878, there's a woman by the name of Caroline Merrick, who's a great leader of the early suffrage movement in the state and the city. Another woman who ends up joining her in the early movement is Elizabeth Lyle Saxon. A year later, so that's in 1878, a year later in 1879, Louisiana is again writing a new state constitution. Caroline Merrick and Elizabeth Lyle Saxon are invited to speak to the suffrage committee of that state constitutional convention, and they do. And apparently they do so with making a great argument and are really well received by the media time and by the members of that body. Of course, they do nothing with that information. But what does happen is that the local efforts towards women's suffrage begin to build. And over the decades, the late 19th century, you see more organizations, lots of them are starting to look more towards civic engagement, political activism, and suffrage.
But it's a largely segregated effort, and there is a battle within the battle over how suffrage should happen and who should have it.
And just like their counterparts, there are a lot of women's clubs forming in the Black community at that point, whether they be social or literary or what have you. And they're looking more towards the same thing: political agency, civic engagement, fighting back against this idea that women's place is at home. And that's part of the suffrage story too. It's not just this fight for a vote. It's a fight for opportunity to participate fully as a citizen.
New Orleans educator Sylvanie Williams emerges as a suffrage leader.
She's a very busy woman and accomplishes a lot, but you see her pop up at specific moments related to suffrage as well. One of them being in 1903, the National American Women's Suffrage Association has their annual meeting in New Orleans. And actually, it's the first time that organization had their meeting in the South. But this meeting ends up being segregated because it's here in the South, and because the host organizations didn't want to include the Black organization. So Sylvania Williams, Phyllis Wheatley Club aren't able to participate. But what we see is that some of the leaders, national leaders of women's suffrage, Susan B. Anthony and Dorothy Dix, these national figures, go and visit with the Phyllis Wheatley Club and Sylvania Williams in 1898, where the state is once again writing a new constitution. And this is commonly known as the kind of Jim Crow constitutions. They, in a sense, disenfranchise Black voters. At the same time, this state constitution expands suffrage in a very limited way, but in effect, it only relates to white women. And what they say is that if you are a tax-paying citizen, you may vote on issues related to taxation. So if you fast forward back to the years preceding the passage of the amendment, a number of groups locally are pushing for a state amendment. And you specifically see this with Kate and Jean Gordon, who at this point have really spoken loudly about their desire for it to be a state amendment because of the need to retain white supremacy. And these aren't my words, these are their words directly. They repeatedly use this language. The other suffrage groups, the majority of them in New Orleans and the South, are more interested in suffrage generally speaking for women. It's important to get suffrage passed.
In 1920, the state legislature passes a measure to give women the vote. But the voting public, mostly white men, give it thumbs down. However, the national momentum for suffrage could not be stopped.
By 1919, 1920, it kind of feels like something that's going to happen, especially as it goes through Congress and finally is passed and sent to the states. So once it goes through Congress, it needs 36 states to vote for it. It gets like 35 votes basically right away. It comes to Louisiana. Louisiana does not support the passage of the amendment. They do not vote for it. And it eventually gets to Tennessee. And Tennessee in August votes to pass the 19th Amendment, and it becomes law. And that's in August of 1920.
While the right to vote was won by women, being able to actually exercise that right was still stymied for many.
There are a number of ways that the white majority is able to control political power. One way is through limiting accessibility at the ballot box, so making it hard for people to register to vote.
Nationally and locally, women coalesced to remedy that problem.
The League of Women Voters of the United States, the National League, actually was formed 6 months before the signing of the 19th Amendment. However, when the League of Women Voters of New Orleans was formed is sometimes debatable. There was a group that was formed in the 30s, around 33, that was called the Women's Citizens Union. And this was, what many people would suggest, the beginning of the League of Women Voters of New Orleans. Its mission at that period of time, of course, and the mission of the National League was to give women information because they had just gotten the right to vote. It was highly segregated. However, the leaders such as Rosa Keller and Martha Robinson would provide instructional meetings for Black women to learn how to register people to vote. But certainly it was everything was segregated in the South, and organizations were. At that point, there was not too many people. Then it became much more the membership because, as we all know, women had limited avenues to be activists. So this volunteer group in the League was considered quite a reputable group, and it became a project for many women to be able to use their talents, their strengths, and their leadership.
One woman barred from the League chose voter registration as an early step on her journey as an activist and community leader. Sybil Hydell Morial, career education professional, wife of New Orleans' first black mayor and the mother of the third, tells a personal story of the struggle to end segregation in her book, Witness to Change, From Jim Crow to Political Empowerment.
The stories that I tell in my memoir are what was happening in my time, in my generation. We were coming of age and realizing that things were not fair, and what could we do about it? And so the really breakthrough was when the Supreme Court unanimously determined that separated public schools were unconstitutional. And that was the opening, that was the light at the end of the tunnel, that the national government recognized that all was not fair to all citizens. My growing up in a segregated city really was forming my attitudes for the future. Being held back, being denied, being said you can't. And then when I went to college, I went to Xavier University here, historically black college, for 2 years. But I wanted to go north. I wanted to experience a different life. And so in my junior year, I transferred to Boston University. One of my classmates and friends was Martin Luther King. And we would meet at our social events and talk about what was coming in the South. And every one of us, even though we loved the freedoms of the North, we all determined we were going back south because we wanted to be part of the change.
As a Massachusetts schoolteacher back in New Orleans on summer break in 1954, Sybil Hydell became reacquainted with Dutch Morial. 8 months later, they married. When they returned home after a year and a half in Baltimore, Dutch jumped into the civil rights movement as an attorney fighting to change the laws and as president of the New Orleans chapter of the NAACP.
And I was home with 2 toddlers, and I couldn't wait for him to come home to tell me the real skinny on what was going on. And I guess in my mind I said, well, you know, I don't want to be a spectator. I want to be out there. And so some of my girlfriends, we had a little club that we did some do-good things in the community. We said, well, what can we do? Well, the vote was what we needed. We had to get enough African Americans to have the vote, to have a voice at the table. And back then, voter registration was a big process. You had to take a citizenship test, a literacy test. You had to figure your age in years, months, weeks, and days. You try that. If you figured it yesterday, you're going to mess up when you say it today. We knew League of Women Voters was doing voter registration, but they rejected us. Not because some of them did not want us to join, but because there was state law that said whites and blacks could not meet together. So when we were rejected, we started our own voter registration workshops, we call them. So on Tuesday nights, we went to our assigned place and we talked to people. They were hungry to vote. And we reviewed all that they would have to do, encouraged them to go down to the voter registration office. And some of them had to go 2 or 3 times, but they never gave up. And we were so personally rewarded that they were so eager to become voters. That was the beginning of my full participation in the changes that were coming about.
If you look back at kind of the civil rights movement in New Orleans and really look at that kind of period in the 50s and 60s, a lot of the work, a lot of the leadership comes down to women. People like Aretha Castle Haley, who leads CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, and her sister Doris Jean Castle. And you see these interracial coalitions. You see people like Lindy Boggs and Sybil Morial purposely coming together. You see the YWCA and Rosa Keller coming and saying, we need to all be working together on this issue.
Rosa Keller was so energetic about voting rights, she wrote a history of the League of Women Voters of New Orleans. Her fight on many fronts for equality for black citizens included her role as first female appointee to the library board.
You know, there was one poor little library on Dryades, I think it was, and the books that were falling apart and not fit for the white libraries went over there, kind of like the school books in the segregated school system. And some of the librarians came to her and said, you know, we're in the business of helping people read. We don't like turning away these children when they come to us. And so she kept bringing it up at meetings and was met with resistance.
She had supported Chep Morrison when he ran for mayor. And the public library was going to open a new branch up in the Broadmoor neighborhood. So Rosa called Mayor Morrison, and she said, I want to talk to you about something. There's a new branch of the New Orleans Public Library about to open. It's in a mixed neighborhood. There are black children that live in that neighborhood. The libraries are segregated. Black children can't go to their neighborhood branch. He said, I'll think about it. She said, I want you to think very deeply about it. So she didn't hear from him for a while. And one night, long after everyone else had gone to bed, he called and he said, Mrs. Keller, this is Chep Morrison. She said, oh, I'm happy to hear from you. He said, well, I want you to know that the libraries are now open to all citizens, black and white. She said, I'm thrilled. I know the kids in Broadmoor will love it. He said, no, I mean all of the branches.
The 1955 integration of New Orleans public libraries was followed by a years-long boycott and picketing of stores that would not hire black clerks. Women shared leadership of the movement that also featured Canal Street lunch counter sit-ins.
We developed a tactic called hit and run. In a hit and run, we would send in the white corps member. They would go to the lunch counter, order the food. When the food arrived, a black corps member would go in and sit where that person sat and ate the food. We also did this in the back. In the black part, we sent a black corps member in, ordered the food. When the food came, a white corps member would go and eat.
Other community organizers persuaded families to be brave enough to integrate public schools. That's the role Burnett Joshua Johnson played with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund for a few summers before graduation from Spelman College.
And my job was to go in, sit on the front porch, and convince these parents that, you know, there may be some obstacles, but you really should send your child to that newly desegregated school because the judgment's going to be meaningless unless someone takes advantage of it. And all of them, not my 5-year-old, let somebody else do it. I don't want my child subjected to that. Go talk to some other parent.
That work was the reason she ended up at LSU Law School, which launched a career as first woman elected judge at Orleans Civil District Court and first African-American Chief Justice of the state Supreme Court. Another close ally of Dutch Morial was a PTA president named Dorothy May Taylor.
And she became one of the real leaders in my husband's campaign for the state legislature. So after my husband was no longer in the legislature, he went on to become a juvenile court judge. Dorothy Taylor was a natural to run for it because she had the networks. The people knew her. They trusted her. They relied on her. And she was elected. She represented black people, women, all women, quite well in the legislature and on the city council. And as the only black, she spoke her mind.
If we had not done the work to pass the 19th Amendment to give women the right to vote, what would our landscape look like? All of that wasted talent and all of the resources, all of the women who've served admirably over the years would not have had those opportunities to serve.
While working to protect the right to vote, women also turned their sights on becoming candidates themselves. In the last quarter of the 20th century, they joined forces to elect more women to office.
Years ago, the League was kind of the only show in town, but now there are so many more, like an independent women's organization, IWO. It's been around for quite some time. In the 1990s, the League, the IWO, and the Committee of 21 came together and had instructions for women so that they could run for office.
The Committee of 21 was founded by the first woman elected U.S. Senator from Louisiana, Mary Landrieu, who served 3 terms working to increase Louisiana's offshore oil and gas revenues, Medicaid expansion, coastal restoration, and Katrina recovery. She had campaign experience to share. She was elected state treasurer, succeeding the first woman in that position, Mary Evelyn Parker. And before that, won in 1979 at age 23, a seat in the State House of Representatives where women were in the minority.
It was just 3 of us out of 49 legislators. There were no women in the Senate, none.
The eldest of 9 children, she credits her parents, the former mayor and First Lady of New Orleans, Moon and Verna Landrieu, for her passion for politics and equal rights.
She had a passion for social justice, really wanted to work for the empowerment of women and African Americans. I felt like, I had been in school with so many bright, amazing girls and women taught by the most amazing teachers and nuns. I thought, why isn't anyone listening to what the women have to say?
Her motivation came from her parents and those who inspired them.
As my mother grew in her own right, she was very close to Lindy Boggs. Lindy Boggs was a true inspiration to my mother and to me and to my father.
Lindy Boggs, of course, the New Orleans Congresswoman and Vatican ambassador. She and women like Rosa Keller and many others Landrieu cites as examples of leadership.
I could think about these women that when I was young, they were in their, I was in my 20s, they were in their 60s. They would be well over 100 today. They were around when women got the right to vote in the 1920s. We were all mentored by the generations before us. What I'm really most proud of is the day I walked into the legislature, I made a mental note: do not try to be like the men. Do not think you have to think that like them. Do not be intimidated by the agenda that they put in front of you. I said 2 things to myself. I'm not going to just blend into this furniture. I'm not here just to fit in. And number 2, I'm going to do everything I can to make sure that more women follow me.
And they have in numerous leadership roles. From Louisiana's first woman governor, Kathleen Blanco, to the city of New Orleans' first woman mayor, LaToya Cantrell, to the first woman president for Jefferson Parish, Cynthia Lee Sheng, and the late Pat Brister as president of St. Tammany Parish. Over the decades, women have held and continue to hold elective offices and administrative positions at many levels across the state. And with that political power comes opportunity to create change.
We want to have an equal voice because I wanted the women's movement in our city and in our state to be together with the African American community, not separate, because in some places it was, and I knew that. And so Kathleen Blanco, Diana Bajwa is an African American woman, served with me in the legislature. She was the only African American woman for many years. Dorothy Mae Taylor was the first, but Diane served for the longest time and still has an impact to this day. We all made a pact to really always try to get along. And even though we could disagree, we knew that we were such a small number that we had to stay united. What's more important to me is now what's on the law books or what's in the budget. Daycare, domestic support for domestic violence, equal justice, criminal justice reform. These are issues that women have fought for and put on the agenda, and I'm glad that our place on the podium has resulted not just in a more diverse scene, but a more just law book. It has come so far since the 1960s and 70s, but obviously we have a lot more work to do.
It's only been 100 years since women had the right to vote. That's shocking when you really think about it. I was born into a world where there probably were very few women in elected office, and now, you know, I think it has gotten a lot easier for women to run. It's more normal to see a woman in a race now. It's very normal to see a woman win that race. It's a little harder, I think, because we're so underrepresented, though, being like 17% of the State House and Senate. It's still a little tricky to get leadership positions.
Former State Representative Julie Stokes served in the Louisiana House and was set to make a bid for state treasurer when sidelined by breast cancer. Now a leader in the nonprofit world, she looks to women to bring balance to the political sphere.
I'm just a pragmatist, and at heart, I think we need pragmatism. And we definitely need more women, but we also don't need more hyper-partisan people. It would be great if the women could be what stood for bringing some pragmatism and data-driven solutions and working across the aisle with the other women. If we could bring that to the table, we could change the world right now.
Well, I think women leaders right now in this moment really have to dig deep in our sort of sense of self about being mothers and role models for our children. And when women have put their shoulder to the wheel in great movements, whether it was a labor movement, fighting for the garment workers, whether it was the civil rights movement, many, many brave women stood together across racial lines to break down barriers for everyone, and I hope that we will continue to do that.
To not have the right to vote, I mean, think about that for a moment. If you take your right to vote for granted, remember for a moment that 100 years ago you wouldn't have had that right. What would that have felt like to not have the right? It would have felt oppressed. It would have felt like the deck was stacked against you. It would have felt horrible. So treat that right to vote as you would respect it if you didn't have it. Because 100 years is a blink of an eye. It's a blink of an eye.
Whenever I speak to young people, this is what I say to them. What do you care about today? What is important to you? Then be a voice. You have an obligation to live out your concerns for our planet, for our government, for our society, for our way of life. It's your turn now.
The Vote, Louisiana Women Lead, made possible by WGBH. Additional funding by Sandra Thompson Herman.